In this week's House of Commons debate on the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, a number of ex-military MPs had their say. Tom Tugendhat, Johnny Mercer and Dan Jarvis had all served in Afghanistan, and all were critical of Joe Biden's decision to withdraw from the country. They described Britain's presence in Afghanistan as bringing progress, stability and freedom. The problem for them was that we didn't stay for long enough. However, there is another MP who served in Afghanistan who didn't get the chance to speak in that debate and who has a different perspective. Clive Lewis served in Afghanistan in 2009 and he joins me now. You tweeted after that debate that you would have had a different perspective to some of those veteran MPs who spoke, so the Tom Tugendhat and the like. What would you have said differently if you'd had the chance to speak?
I'm very proud of the people I serve with. The vast majority of them are good people who are there for, I think, the right reasons. It's never the soldiers. Our brothers, our sisters, our aunts, our uncles, our cousins, our neighbours who are the problem. It's the politicians that send them and the motivations behind them being sent. And I think most of them were there to try and do some good. Nonetheless, I think given the time that I've had now to reflect on it, what I've seen of the war on terror, the trillions of dollars and billions of pounds that have been spent on this war, the 37 million refugees that have been created from this conflict. And by the way, many of those same countries who have been engaged in that 20-year war on terror are also the same countries that are putting up walls and borders and leaving the European Union to be able to have their own migration policy, etc., etc. The very same countries that are stopping those migrants from being able to flee the war zones, which we've unfortunately helped to create. And so I think, like many people, I've begun to see that this war was a futile war. It was a war that was wrong. I'm not the first soldier that's been in a conflict that's come out, changed and seen things, I think, in a different light. I saw people wounded by NATO forces, young people, a young boy of 15 with his foot blown off for doing nothing more than tending his father's livestock in their fields. When you've seen that, it does make you question the visceral image in your head, the smell, the sight. It does make you question why you're there, what you're doing, especially in hindsight. And I think, given the fact that one of the key reasons why we were in Afghanistan, arguably to make it a better, more a country, stop it from being a failed state, to help the Afghan people, to economically uplift it. It's still one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of food security. It's placed number 2 on the world's kind of danger list. 40% of the population are without a job. 70% of them live below the poverty line. That's after 20 years of so-called uplift in Afghanistan. If we had spent a fraction of that money, of those trillions, of those hundreds of billions that we poured into the military and armed conflict in Afghanistan, maybe we would have made a genuine difference in that country, but we didn't. And now we find ourselves in a situation where the only people who've become enriched from this war, it's not the veterans that have come back here that are struggling to find their support in mental health services, are struggling with PTSD, still fighting this government for justice for what's happened to them. It's also the Afghan people that have received, very little. The people who've benefited are the people who have made absolute fortunes as part of the kind of transnational security elites of this world, the corporate powers that have invested heavily in the Lockheed Martins, the Halliburtons, and others in this country that have made an absolute fortune from us, British taxpayers, US taxpayers in this country. And that wealth has gone to Afghanistan and then been funneled to them and those corporate executives and those corporations. So this is a money-making machine for them. Lockheed Martin, I think, won the biggest contract ever in the United States without having to bid for it at all once the war in Afghanistan was announced. And so, from my perspective, looking at this war, looking at where we're finding ourselves, looking at the so-called lessons that have been learned, that was a phrase that was used quite a lot in Parliament yesterday. I don't think the House has learned its lessons. I think this whole notion of liberal interventionism, let's be really clear what it is. It's about us deciding that we have a God-given right to go into other countries still. It's it's an imperial hang-up that we have the right to go into other countries and bomb them or occupy them to find democracy. Doesn't work. Didn't work in Libya. Hasn't worked in Syria with the bombing that we've done there. Didn't work in Iraq. In fact, it's caused more destabilization, more refugees, more violence, more destruction. And some people have benefited, but not the people in those countries and not the people here, not the people who were sent out there to fight from this country. The people who've benefited, as I said, are those elites and 1% who have enriched themselves on that 20-year, multi-trillion pound so-called war on terror. And, you know, at the same time, our civil liberties have been destroyed, undermined. You know, so much of that emergency legislation after 9/11, governments haven't given up those powers. They've held on to them. And I suppose from that perspective, I would have spoken about some of those issues in the chamber. I would have liked 7 minutes, like many of the other veterans received of Afghanistan. I would have been happy with 3. I got 0.
Why is that? Is that just a technicality? Is that because the luck of the draw, or was there someone who would have been able to donate you their speaking time, for example?
I think it's one of those issues which will forever be debated about whether it was cock up or conspiracy. It could have been a bit of both. It could have been one or the other. I'm not gonna. You know, look, at the end of the day, I'm not going to, you know, sit here and pass conjecture on whether it was a cock up or conspiracy. I think it. You know, look, I think it was what it was. I didn't get to speak. I think I should have. I've been told that I will be called early on at the next debate. But the reality is, this was the debate that mattered. This was the debate where Parliament had been recalled. This was when the public were listening to what happened. And if you were listening to that debate last week, you would have come away, quite rightly, thinking that there was a consensus, almost a consensus. I know Jeremy and Diane and Zara Sultana and a few other dissenting voices spoke, but you would have thought overwhelmingly that the consensus in that house was that this was a war that actually was just, was right. People were talking about, Tom Tugendhat and others talking about the West and our democratic values, about human rights. Where was our concern about the human rights and democratic values these last 20 years? You know, we now know because of whistleblowers in the US, one of whom has now been in prison. I can't recall his name. We now know that 90% of those people killed in the drone attacks over the last 20 years in Afghanistan were civilians. You know, I was chair of the APPG, the all-party parliamentary group on drones a few years back. And we had a US whistleblower that came over to Parliament and told us that there was a policy in the US, which was that they didn't need authorization to kill a suspected terrorist if there were up to 7 civilians around them or innocents. Anything over that had to go up. But that meant that they could have 7 children around them and they were authorized. So you understand then where that 90% figure came from. So, you know, where was the concern for their rights, their human rights? Where was the concern for their lives these past 20 years from them same politicians? And so, you know, it does bring into question sometimes these, I think, I'm not going to say crocodile tears. I actually think the people speaking in Parliament actually believe what they're saying, which is perhaps more terrifying in some ways. But I just feel that there are sometimes double standards. You know, the question you ask yourselves, and the question I often ask myself, where if the Taliban was sat on petrochemical resources, do I think that certain powers within the West would have found an accommodation with them? They found an accommodation with those who have strategic interests that they want in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, in Yemen, in other countries around the world, in Egypt, which is a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship, but it has a Suez Canal and it's also geopolitically important. They found an accommodation with them. I kind of feel to myself, well, what's different about Saudi Arabia and its particular brand of Islamism compared to what the Taliban are kind of practicing. So I'm sure someone out there will tell me that there are major differences, but the bottom line is Saudi Arabia is an autocratic, repressive, violent regime, and yet they are one of our biggest exporters of arms and technology and military advice that we give to them. So, I think there are double standards. And I think when you look at the bigger picture, when you look at who's profited, when you look at who's made money, when you look at who's been dying, when you look at the so-called human rights abuses that have taken place, yes, by the Taliban, but also by ourselves, then you begin to see a far more complicated and muddied picture. And it wasn't quite the picture that was being painted in Parliament yesterday, that we were some kind of knights on shining armor who kind of went into Afghanistan and for whatever reason stabbed in the back by, if not the US president, Joe Biden. If only we'd been allowed to do what we went there to do, all would be well. Well, I guess the question I now ask myself is, should we have been there in the first place? There are lots of, if you look around the world, there are lots of nasty regimes. The world is shades of grey, and I think I'm reminded of, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but one of the things I saw recently, which kind of made me take stock, was a kind of piece of footage where I think the new US foreign secretary was having a bilateral talks with his Chinese equivalent, and before the TV cameras were sent out, the US diplomat said, we've got concerns about the Uyghurs, we've got concerns about human rights in China, quite rightly raising those issues. But his Chinese counterpart said, well, yes, we have concerns about your treatment of black people in the United States. We have concerns about human rights abuses that the United States has been committing, not only on its own people, but on people around the world. And he was flabbergasted and taken aback. But that's the truth of it. We are not our foreign policy and the elites that perpetrate it. We are not innocents in this international game. You only have to look at our history. You only have to look at our imperial past that's still playing out to this day to see that it isn't a cut and dry good guys, bad guys. The good guys are in the white hats, the bad guys are in the black hats. It is shades of grey. Do I think that makes Putin a good guy? Do I think that makes Xiaoping and the Chinese authorities in China good guys? No, I don't. But the world is complex, and I think we need to see the world in that light, and also understand that if we are going to make the world a better and safer place as we move into the 21st century with the climate crisis upon us, which is only going to increase instability, bombing our way out of that future is not going to work. In fact, it's a surefire way of hastening our demise. We have got to find new ways of working with others and making sure that we have a foreign policy that is ethical and a foreign policy which is about helping people. And we could start that at COP26 by actually showing real leadership in the world in the fight against the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is being driven by our global economic system. That's what's driving it. That's what needs to change. Do I think the Conservative Party are capable of doing that? No, they're not. Of course they're not, because they are integral to that economic system. But that's what needs to happen. If we don't do that, then I'm afraid to say things are not going to improve. That's how we can show leadership in the world, if that's what the world wants from us, leadership. But I think if that's the way we can go forward, then I think that would be a way to really make a difference to people's lives, to really make a difference to the 21st century as we go into it.
I want to talk about Labour for a bit, and especially that consensus that we saw on Wednesday, because we spoke about it on Novara Media on Wednesday's show. It was almost like looking into an alternate reality where you had everyone standing up, ignoring the whole last 20 years and saying, for the past 20 years, the West have been going around the world trying to bring about democracy, trying to bring about progress. I kind of felt like we'd moved beyond that. People recognize now that the war on terror was, most right-thinking people recognize it was a disaster. And suddenly we had Lisa Nandy, Keir Starmer, everyone standing up and saying these Western countries trying to bring democracy about with guns and bombs was brilliant. And by withdrawing, Biden is now abandoning the forces of freedom, the forces of a rules-based order. And they were essentially saying, Keir Starmer sounded like Tony Blair in the 2000s, basically. And Keir Starmer in the 2000s was a campaigning lawyer against the Iraq War. So I suppose that big change from you or from them. What do you think that's about? Do you think that's that Keir Starmer is terrified to sound unpatriotic, so he feels like he has to say everything the army did was good and the only problem was withdrawing? Or do you think he's had a genuine change of heart and now he is a unabashed liberal interventionist? I mean, how did that extraordinary consensus, as you say, other than Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn, etc., come about?
I actually thought, listening to Keir, I mean, I think a lot of people would probably place Keir somewhere on before he came into politics. And as you said, the work that he did as a human rights barrister would probably place him somewhere in the anti-Iraq, anti-Afghan war camp, I would have thought. I got overtones of that by reading between the lines. That may have me being overly optimistic, but reading between the lines about what he did say and what he didn't say. But I think the question about the tone of Parliament, and I think it came more from other speakers, but the tone in Parliament, the round of applause from our own benches after Tom Tugendhat kind of basically made this quite heroic appeal to liberal interventionism, I think kind of shows you that the party has shifted quite. The PLP, let's be clear here, the PLP has shifted quite fundamentally from where it has been in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, there are always people who have been pro the Iraq or pro so-called liberal interventionism, but I did see a change from some people who I thought might know better, who seem to be cheering that on. And I just wonder whether there's a bit of groupthink going on in the PLP and in Parliament on this. You can understand why. I'm not justifying it, but you can understand why. You've got a kind of almost kind of unified kind of presence on the media from a commentariat in the mainstream media who are buying into this narrative about some kind of defeat for democracy and all that's good and shiny from the West that's happening here. I got the sense that there were people in that chamber, especially on the Conservative side, who were itching for us to prove that the West is not weak. People like Ian Duncan Smith and others. And I think there is a real concern that there will be people in that place who will want to settle scores, who will want to show to the world that the West isn't weak in the face of so-called threats from China and Russia and other so-called autocratic states. They will want to kind of prove themselves and for the West to take the first opportunity to prove itself. Now, I think the mood in the chamber the other day was concerning in that if that mood is the mood that we can expect, should there be such a crisis, then my concern is that Parliament would almost unanimously, I'm not going to say unanimously, actually. I think you probably find elements of the SNP, Liberal Democrats as well, who would probably oppose it. But there would be a consensus, a majority for yet further military action. And I'm concerned about that. Why it's happening, but I think there's clearly been a shift politically inside the Labour Party. I think you'd have to be living on the moon to not understand why that's happened. I couldn't give you any other analysis other than that there has been a mood change. The mood music has changed inside the PLP. I think this, unfortunately, sometimes brings out the worst in our party. It's almost as if Black Lives Matter and the taking of the knee and George Floyd, it's almost as if it happened in a bubble somewhere else. I mean, surely the whole point about Black Lives Matter, about George Floyd, was about understanding the history of racism, of empire, of colonialism, of where it came from and how it is alive and well today, and that racism is a function of that. I thought that's what we all took. Well, I thought that's what we all learned and took from the Black Lives Matter campaign and from George Floyd's death, that racism, that structural racism, is a throwback, if you want, that the original kind of stone dropping into the pond, it's a ripple from that original pond of slavery, empire, and colonialism. I thought that's what we learned, and that these wars, where we think that we have a moral right to go into other countries and impose democracy by occupation and bombing, is our kind of God-given right. Do people not see the connection between them all? And it just feels as if it's been done in isolation. So, look, it was really difficult to listen to some of that in the chamber. And I think look, to your listeners out there, to your MPs who are in that chamber, if you're in the Labour Party still, you need to be questioning your MPs at your next CLP meeting and asking them for their analysis of what's happened in Afghanistan, why it's gone wrong, and what they think we should be doing next as a party in terms of moving forward on this issue. Because unless they actually have an analysis that's rooted in the reality of our imperial past, that's rooted in the analysis in the reality of who is making money from these wars, vast amounts of wealth from these wars, is rooted in an analysis of the reality of the geopolitical situation in this world, is rooted in an analysis of what is happening in the climate crisis, that destabilization is going to be increasing, not decreasing, then unless they have that analysis, unless they have actually thought about this and can give you kind of pretty good answers on it, then you need to tell them to educate themselves and find out about it. Because I don't see how any so-called democratic socialist, social democrat can look at this world, can look at what's happening in Afghanistan, cannot join the dots up between all the points that I've made and come to the conclusion that the era of liberal interventionism has to end. Has to end.